They showed up with clipboards, fake patches, and threats convinced they could scare a man into giving up his house. But what they didn't know was that 6 Navy SEALs were on their way to his driveway. The sound came sharp and sudden. 3 heavy knocks against the front door of Calvin Dunmore's home. In Concord, North Carolina, it wasn't late, but it wasn't early either, just past 6 in the evening when most people were winding down and dinner simmering on stoves, TV sets, flickering in living rooms. Calvin had been in the kitchen rinsing off a plate when the noise came. Something about it wasn't casual. It wasn't the soft knock of a neighbor dropping by. It was forceful, demanding he dried his hands on a dish towel and walked toward the door, the weight of the knock still hanging in his chest. Calvin wasn't the type to get rattled easily at 44. He'd been through plenty, financial struggles, raising kids, even losing his wife to divorce. But the moment he opened that door, his night shifted into something he never imagined. 2 men stood there, both in tactical vests with bold white letters, HOA Enforcement Division. They looked like law enforcement radios clipped to their belts, clipboards in their hands and stern faces that didn't crack a smile. Well, one of them, tall, with a shaved head and a scar above his right eyebrow, spoke first. "Mr. Dunmore." Calvin blinked. "Yeah, that's me. You've been found in violation of neighborhood code," the man said in a rehearsed tone. "Per HOA policy, you're required to vacate this property within 48 hours. Calvin let out a short laugh, the kind you give when someone tells a bad joke. "Vacate? What are you talking about? I own this house, paid off the mortgage 7 years ago. I just spoke to the HOA president at last month's meeting." The second man, shorter and stockier with mirrored sunglasses hiding his eyes, even in the shade, stepped forward. "Doesn't matter. You're out of compliance. We've been authorized to serve. Notice you've got 2 days to clear out." For a moment, Calvin thought it had to be some kind of prank. He looked at the patch again. HOA Enforcement Division. He'd lived here for almost a decade. He'd seen HOA notices, dues, trash bins left on the curb, grass growing too high but never armed, looking men telling someone to get out. "This makes no sense," Calvin said, his voice firm. "Now, if I had an issue with the HOA, they'd send me a letter, or at worst I'd get a fine. Nobody shows up in tactical gear." The tall one leaned in just enough to make the air feel heavier. "Sir, we're not here to debate. We're here to enforce. You can either leave quietly or we can escalate." Calvin's jaw clenched. He wasn't a fighter by nature, but he wasn't naive either. His father had always told him, real authority doesn't need to overcompensate. Something about these 2 men was off. Their badges looked like cheap printouts laminated at a copy shop. Their clipboards had generic paperwork, HOA letterhead, those signatures. And those radios, he noticed they weren't even switched on. "Let me ask you something," Calvin said, folding his arms across his chest. "Who sent you? What's the president's name? What violation code am I supposedly breaking?" The stocky one shifted his stance, clearly irritated. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. We're giving you a chance to walk away on your own terms. Most people would take it." Calvin stared at them, silence stretching out. He could feel the tension crawling in. These men weren't from the HOA. They weren't even from any official agency. They were fakes. But the problem was they were standing on his porch trying to strong-arm him out of his own home. "You 2 need to get off my property," Calvin said, finally, his voice steady but sharp right now. The tall one smirked. What, you're gonna call the police and tell them the HOA came to your door? Go ahead. See how fast they show up for that." Calvin's chest tightened, not out of fear but anger. He knew this was bigger than a misunderstanding. It was a setup, a scam designed to scare him into giving up something he had worked too hard to earn. He looked past them toward the street, hoping a neighbor might be outside. Nobody, just the sound of a distant lawnmower and a dog barking somewhere down the block. The stocky one lowered his voice, almost a growl. "Last warning, 48 hours after that. We'll handle it our way." Calvin stood still, staring at them, until they finally turned and walked back toward a black SUV parked at the curb. He shut the door and locked it, his hands trembling not from fear, but from fury. He had no idea yet that backup was already on its way. Old friends who would turn this night upside down in ways the fake cops never expected, but trouble wasn't done. Knocking, this was only the beginning. Calvin didn't sit down after shutting that door. He paced the living room, his mind running circles. Who in the world had the nerve to show up, dressed like law enforcement, flashing fake patches and threatening to kick him out of his own home? He pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled through his contacts, hovering over the HOA president's number, but stopped. Something told him not to call just yet. Whoever those men were, they wanted him rattled. They wanted him panicking, making desperate calls. He wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. Instead, he took a breath, opened the blinds, and looked out toward the street. The black SUV was still there. The two men hadn't left. They were sitting inside, the driver in the front seat, the passenger tapping away at something on a tablet. Watching him waiting, Calvin muttered under his breath, "Yeah, real official." He opened the door again and stepped onto the porch, refusing to let them think he was hiding. "Hey," he called out, his voice loud enough for half the street to hear, "You mind telling me who exactly sent you here?" The SUV door opened and the tall one climbed out, his boots heavy against the pavement. He walked back toward Calvin with a slow, deliberate stride. "We already told you," the man said, his tone clipped. "We're here on behalf of the HOA. Calvin shook his head. "No, you didn't tell me anything. You threw a line at me and hoped I'd swallow it. So let's try again. Name which board member authorized this." The man stopped at the edge of the lawn. His jaw twitched. "You're asking too many questions for a guy who's about to be homeless." That did it. Calvin stepped down off his porch, closing the distance until they were just a few feet apart. "You picked the wrong door," he said flatly. "I've been paying into this neighborhood since before you probably knew it existed. If the board had an issue, I'd get an email, a letter, or a meeting, not two guys in fake vests trying to muscle me out." The passenger got out of the SUV, now striding up with his mirrored shades gleaming. He pulled a sheet of paper from his clipboard and shoved it toward Calvin. "Here, read it. You'll see, we're not messing around." Calvin snatched the paper and glanced down. It was laughable. No letterhead, no signatures, no official seal, just a typed-up form with blank lines and a few bolded phrases. "Violation of Code 14B, non-compliance, mandatory eviction." It looked like something pulled off a free template online. Calvin looked up and smirked. "You seriously think anyone's gonna fall for this garbage?" He waved the paper in the air. "This isn't worth the printer ink." The shorter one bristled. "You don't get it, do you? We don't need you to believe us. We just need you to pack your stuff and go. Most people don't argue." "They're too scared. They don't want trouble. Then you came to the wrong house." Calvin snapped, "Because I don't scare easy for a beat." Silence hung between them, heavy and tense. The tall one leaned forward just enough to lower his voice. "Listen, man, we can do this. The polite way, or we can do it the hard way. Nobody wants the hard way." Calvin stared back, refusing to budge. He could feel his heart beating harder now, not from fear, but from adrenaline. These men weren't just scammers. They were predators, banking on intimidation to make someone cave. But Calvin had grown up tough. He'd been through real fights in life. The kind you don't walk away from without scars. He wasn't about to fold over a fake eviction notice. "You step one foot onto this porch again," Calvin said, his voice like stone. "And I promise you'll regret it." The shorter one sneered. "What are you gonna do? Call the cops? They'll take hours to get here, and by then we'll already be gone." Calvin's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I won't need the cops." The tall one cocked his head, curious. "Oh yeah, who you got?" Then Calvin's eyes flicked toward the end of the street, where a line of headlights had just turned the corner, 3 vehicles moving slow, rolling down the block. At first, the impostors didn't notice. But Calvin did. He knew those cars, he knew those men. His backup wasn't a what, it was a who. The taller man glanced over his shoulder and frowned. "Friends of yours?" Calvin folded his arms. You could say that the SUVs came to a stop. Engines cutting, doors opened one after another, and 6 men stepped out, each one carrying the kind of presence you don't mistake for anything else. Broad shoulders, sharp eyes, a way of standing that said they'd seen things most people never had. Jonas Redden, Marcus and Vale Pierce, Lockhart, Damien Crowell, Silas, Trent, Vaughn, Kessler, all of them former Navy SEALs, all of them Calvin's brothers in arms. The tall impostor's smirk finally faltered, but this wasn't the end of the confrontation. It was only about to get louder. The moment Calvin's friends stepped out of their vehicles, the air shifted. You could feel it in the way the impostors stiffened, the way their earlier arrogance suddenly seemed to falter. These weren't just a couple of guys stopping by for beers. This was a wall of muscle discipline and calm authority. Walking down the driveway, Honus reddened, tall with gray streaks in his beard and the kind of stare that could freeze a room, was the first to speak. "Cal, what's going on here?" His tone was steady, but there was steel behind it. Calvin gestured toward the two so-called enforcers. "These clowns say they're from the HOA. Told me I have to pack up and leave my own house in 2 days. The men exchanged quick glances. Pierce Lockhart let out a sharp laugh that cut through the tension. "You've got to be kidding me." Marcus and Vale stepped forward, his eyes locked on the impostors. "HOA? Enforcement Division. Huh, funny. I've never heard of that in my life. You mind showing us some real credentials?" The tall impostor bristled, but tried to keep his composure. "This is official business, doesn't concern you. Step aside." Jonas didn't move. None of them did. "You just made it our business?" Silas. Trent tilted his head, studying the patches on their vests. "Those look like they were ordered off a surplus website last week. Stitching's too clean, no?" "Wear and tear, real field gear doesn't look like that." The shorter impostor adjusted his mirrored shades, his voice sharp. "We're not here to debate uniforms, we're here to enforce rules." Damian Crowell crossed his arms. "Which rules? Name the statute." "Give us the HOA code you're enforcing. Shouldn't be hard, if you're legit." The impostors hesitated. That pause, just a couple of seconds too long, was all the confirmation the SEALs needed. "Vaughn." Kessler chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "These guys are bluffing so hard it hurts." Calvin, standing a few feet behind his friends, now felt a surge of relief. He wasn't imagining it. These men weren't real, and now he had backup. Who knew how to sniff out a lie better than anyone? The tall impostor tried again, doubling down. "You don't understand how serious this is. He's in violation. He's got to leave. We've got paperwork." Jonas cut him off. "Paperwork?" He snatched the flimsy notice from Calvin's hand, holding it up for everyone to see. "This. My kid could type this up in 10 minutes. No signatures, no legal reference, nothing binding. You think anyone's gonna buy this?" The impostor's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, but Jonas didn't move an inch. Calvin noticed neighbors starting to peek out through blinds, a couple even standing on their porches. Word was spreading. People could feel the tension in the air, and curiosity was pulling them in. Pierce, never one to mince words, leaned forward. "Let me ask you something straight. What's the game here? You boys running a scam, picking random houses and hoping to scare folks into leaving so you can loot them?" The shorter one snapped back. "Watch your mouth or what?" Pierce's tone sharpened. "You gonna arrest us with those toy radios? Maybe flash those dollar store badges again?" Silas grinned, though his voice stayed cold. "You made a big mistake coming here. You thought you'd find someone who'd panic and fold. Instead, you found a guy with 6 brothers who don't back down." Calvin stepped forward again, emboldened. "Now you really thought I was gonna believe the HOA sent you with combat vests and no odds that I'd just pack up and leave? Man, I worked too hard for this house. I've got kids who grew up here. You don't get to walk in and threaten me." The tall impostor's confidence cracked just a little. His shoulders shifted, his stance loosening as if he realized the numbers weren't in his favor anymore. Still, he tried to salvage control. "You all think this is a joke, but you're interfering with official duties. That's a crime." Vaughn barked out a laugh. "The only crime happening here is you pretending to be something you're not. And trust me, impersonating law enforcement carries a real sentence." The impostors exchanged nervous looks. They weren't used to being called out this directly. Calvin realized then how rehearsed they'd been, before throwing vague lines leaning on intimidation, hoping nobody would question them. But now their script was falling apart, and they had no backup plan. Jonas folded the fake notice in half and stuffed it into the impostor's vest pocket. "Here's the deal. You've got two choices. Get back in your car and drive off this street right now, or stay and let us call the police. Either way, this isn't ending the way you planned." The shorter imposter clenched his jaw, muttering something under his breath. The taller one scanned the group, calculating. Calvin could see it in his eyes. He was sizing up whether these men were bluffing, or whether they really would drag the cops into this. What the imposters didn't know was that Jonas had already pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over the dial screen, ready to press call, but just as the tension reached its peak, something happened that raised the stakes even higher. The street had grown unusually still. Neighbors stayed frozen on porches and at windows, straining to hear every word, but too wary to intervene. Calvin stood firmly behind his friends, heart pounding in rhythm with the standoff. The imposters shifted uneasily, their earlier swagger giving way to a defensive edge. They hadn't expected this many eyes on them then. Without warning, the low rumble of another engine cut through the silence. A dark pickup truck turned onto the block, headlights glowing against the late evening haze. It pulled up behind the row of parked vehicles, coming to a stop a few yards from the black SUV. The imposters had arrived in Pierce. Lockhart, who had been keeping his arms casually crossed, gave a half smile. "Looks like the cavalry just showed up." From the driver's seat stepped Dean Morick, another former SEAL who hadn't been able to make it. On time for the reunion, he was broader than the rest, shoulders wide enough to fill a doorway, with a calmness about him that unnerved people. Before he even spoke, Dean shut his door and walked up the driveway, scanning the scene in a way only men trained for conflict do. Every detail, every angle, every potential threat, some party you've got going. "Cal," Dean said, his tone dry but sharp. Calvin exhaled, tension slipping off his shoulders just slightly. "Glad you made it, brother. You walked right into a mess." Dean glanced at the imposters, his eyes narrowing at their vests. "And who are these?" "They claim they're HOA cops," Jonas said flatly, his voice laced with disbelief. Dean raised an eyebrow, his expression almost amused. "You cops? That's a new one." The imposters didn't like the laughter creeping into the group. The tall one stepped forward, trying once again to assert control. "This isn't a joke. He's out of compliance. This is official notice." Dean stopped in his tracks, looking the man up and down. "Official, that vest you're wearing is stitched wrong. Radio's not on, and that patch looks like it came off eBay. You're faking it." The imposter bristled, but Dean's calm certainty made him falter. Marcus and Vale took a step forward. Ward now, his voice low but clear enough for the neighbors to hear. "You know what the problem is with pretending to be something you're not. Eventually, someone who knows the real thing shows up, and when they do, every flaw gets exposed." The shorter imposter spat back. "We don't answer to you. We're here on business. Step aside." Silas Trent tilted his head, his tone measured but cutting. "Business? What business running a shakedown operation in broad daylight? You picked the wrong address for that. This isn't a scared retiree or a single mom. You can push around. This man's got friends who won't let you bully him." Calvin finally stepped up beside Silas, his anger steadying into conviction. "I'm not going anywhere, and neither are these men. So why don't you tell me the real reason you're here?" The imposters exchanged a glance, their silence louder than words. The tall one clenched his jaw, but the rehearsed lines were gone. He had nothing left but presence, and even that was shrinking. Dean's voice cut through again, calm as ever. "I've seen this play before. Intimidation, fake authority. You scared just enough people into leaving, and you walk away with valuables, maybe even resell the property if you're bold. But here's the problem. You came across a man who doesn't scare easy. And worse, you showed up on the same day, 6 SEALs, and I planned a reunion." The neighbors reacted to that. Murmurs carried across the street. A couple of phones lifted higher, recording everything. The imposters had thought they were the hunters. Now they were the ones being cornered by an audience, and men who saw straight through them. The tall one finally snapped, voice raised. "You're interfering with federal business." "That's obstruction," Jonas barked out a laugh so sharp it made the man flinch. "Federal, you're seriously reaching now. HOA is not federal, and neither are you. You've been caught, and the only reason you're still standing here is because we're giving you the choice to walk away." The shorter imposter's hand twitched near his vest, as if he wanted to make a show of reaching for something. Immediately, Von Kessler's voice boomed, "Don't move that hand." His tone was enough to freeze the air. The imposter slowly dropped his arm, realizing just how badly outmatched he was. Calvin looked around. The street had turned into a stage, neighbors with phones up, children peeking through curtains. The imposters visibly rattled, and in the middle, his old friends forming a barrier between him and the frauds. The tall imposter muttered something low to his partner, but Jonas caught it. "We'll come back another time." Dean stepped closer, his voice low and certain. "You won't come back here again, because the next time it won't just be neighbors with cameras, it'll be the police, and we'll make sure every second of this footage gets handed over." The imposters hesitated clearly, weighing their options. Their SUV sat waiting just a few feet away, but walking away now would mean admitting failure in front of everyone. Staying meant being exposed further. But the seals weren't done pressing, and the imposters weren't ready to quit, not yet. The neighborhood was holding its breath. You could almost feel the tension ripple across the street as Calvin's old friends spread out, forming an invisible line between the imposters and the house. The imposters had swagger when they first knocked on the door. Now their confidence looked thinner. With every second, Jonas read and broke the silence. First voice low but carrying all the way across the lawn. "Let's make this real simple. If you're official, you'll have IDs show them." The tall imposter's lips curved into a weak grin. "We don't have to prove anything to you. We're not here for games. Then you've already proven everything." "We need to know," Jonas shot back, Pierce Lockhart, who always had a sharp edge to his humor, "how it carries itself, and you don't have it." The imposter's throat bobbed as he swallowed. The shorter one took a step closer, tilting his chin at Calvin. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." Before Calvin could respond, Von Kessler's voice boomed across the yard. "Wrong. The only thing you'll regret is that you picked the one street with 7 seals standing on it." The timing couldn't have been worse for the imposters. At that exact moment, another neighbor came walking down the block with his dog. He slowed when he saw the scene, then pulled out his phone to record it as well. The crowd had doubled since the first confrontation. People were whispering, murmuring, pointing. Kids were being pulled back by their parents, but even they peeked out from behind legs to catch a glimpse of what was happening. The imposters realized they weren't just facing a handful of men anymore. They were facing a community. Calvin's voice cut through the rising chatter. "You want to keep pushing? Go ahead. Every second you stand here, more people are watching, more phones are rolling. This ends with the police, or it ends with you walking away. Your call." The shorter imposter let out a frustrated laugh, trying to mask nerves. "Police won't do a thing. You'll see." Dean Morick, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. His tone was soft, almost too calm. "That's where you're wrong. Impersonating authority is a charge that sticks, and you just admitted it on 6 phones. You better start thinking about whether pride is worth jail time." That rattled them. Calvin could see it. The quick shift in their breathing, the restless glances at the SUV, the tightening of shoulders. These weren't men ready for jail. They were men who had built their scam on silence and shadows, and right now, everything was daylight. Still, the tall imposter made one last desperate move. He jabbed a finger at Calvin. "This isn't the end. We'll come back, Silas." Trent's voice dropped lower, but it carried with razor clarity. "No, you won't. Because if you do, it won't just be us here. The police will have your names, your faces, your plates. You won't get a second shot." The imposter froze. His partner muttered, "Let's go," under his breath, tugging at his arm, but the tall one stood locked in place, unwilling to lose face in front of an audience. That's when Jonas took a step closer, his shadow falling over the man. "You think holding out makes you look tough. It doesn't. It makes you look desperate, and desperate men always make mistakes." The tension hung there, thick as concrete. Everyone waited to see what the imposters would do. Then finally the tall one spat at the ground, turned on his heel, and stalked toward the SUV. His partner followed slower, head down as they climbed into their vehicle. A cheer broke out from the neighbors, not loud, not rowdy, but enough to signal that everyone watching knew who had won that fight. Calvin exhaled, but his friends didn't relax yet. Jonas leaned close to him, voice quiet. "Don't let your guard down. Men like that, they don't like losing. They'll try to claw back however they can. Calvin nodded his eyes on the SUV as the imposter started the engine. He could feel it in his gut. This wasn't finished, but before the imposters could fully retreat, another twist was about to hit the street, and this time it involved real law enforcement. The imposter's SUV rumbled to life, but it didn't roll forward. The tall one sat behind the wheel, knuckles white against the steering wheel, his jaw still clenched with stubborn pride. The shorter one tapped nervously at the dashboard, clearly itching to get out of there. The crowd's phones stayed aimed directly at them, capturing every twitch, every flicker of hesitation. Calvin stood at the edge of his lawn, his arms crossed. His friends fanned out around him, a human wall between the SUV and the house. Jonas, red and eyes narrowed, finally raised his voice again. If you think you can drive off and come back later, you're mistaken, because every one of us has your faces on camera now. Try this again, and you won't just be a neighborhood problem, you'll be a criminal case. The tall imposter rolled down his window halfway, his voice low but forced. You people don't get it. We've got authorization. You'll be the ones answering questions, not us. Pierce Lockhart snorted authorization. Show it right now, not some garbage template. Show us a real badge, a real ID, otherwise quit pretending. Silas Trent stepped forward, pulling his phone up and hitting record deliberately in front of the imposter. Go ahead, he said, his tone mocking. Give us the name of your supervisor. Let us hear it for the record. Who do you work for? What agency? What number can we call to verify the shorter imposter shot him a glare but didn't answer? The crowd murmured again, louder this time. Whispers spreading, people were piecing it together. These weren't officers. They weren't HOA reps. They were frauds dressed in a costume of authority. Calvin added fuse. You know what? The real HOA president's name is Patricia Landon. I've got her number in my phone and right now, want me to call her on speaker so she can confirm she's never heard of you. The tall imposter's face flushed red, and for the first time he broke eye contact. That tiny crack was enough to send the crowd buzzing again, several neighbors shaking their heads, some muttering figures under their breath. Von Kessler's voice cut in low but sharp. You thought you could scare this man out of his house. You thought a fake vest and some rehearsed lines would be enough, but you didn't count on people standing together. That's where you lost. The shorter imposter's patience snapped. He threw open the SUV door and jumped out, jabbing a finger at Vaughn. You don't know what you're messing with. We're not scared of you. You're just before he could finish. Jonas stepped between them, towering over the man. Jonas didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to put your finger down right now. The imposter froze, finger still in the air, then slowly lowered it. Jonas leaned in closer. You want to threaten somebody, threaten me, but understand this. Your whole scam is finished. Everyone out here knows what you are, and when the cops roll up, they'll know too. The shorter imposter looked around and the reality finally seemed to sink in. Every phone pointed at him, every face watching, every whisper confirming his fraud. He looked smaller now, stripped of the illusion of control. Calvin seized the moment he raised his voice so the whole block could hear. These men showed up on my porch claiming to be HOA Enforcement. They told me I had 48 hours to leave my home. They threatened me, but they're not from the HOA. They're scammers. The crowd reacted with a collective murmur, a few gasps. Even phones zoomed in closer, capturing his words. The imposter's scam wasn't just breaking, it was collapsing. In real time, Pierce clapped his hands once, sharp and loud. Show's over, boys. You've been exposed. You've got one move left. Get in that SUV and disappear before the real cops arrive. The tall imposter finally spoke again, though his voice had lost its earlier power. You'll regret putting this on camera. Silas smirked. Oh, you'll regret ever showing your face on this street. The shorter one tried to salvage dignity. This isn't the last time you'll see us. Dean Morrick stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the hood of the SUV. His voice was calm, almost too calm. Yes, it is. Because the next time you try this, you won't just find veterans on a driveway. You'll find squad cars waiting. You're done. The imposters finally retreated, slamming the doors shut. The SUV jerked forward, pulling away from the curb. The neighbors erupted in conversation, voices rising, phones still recording as the vehicle sped off down the street. Calvin exhaled heavily, shoulders dropping. "That's it then," he muttered. Jonas shook his head. "Not yet. They'll be back, or someone like them will, which means it's time to get the police involved tonight." Calvin nodded, pulling out his phone with a steady hand. "This time you're right. We're not letting this slide." But as Calvin dialed, the sound of sirens in the distance made it clear the night was about to take an even bigger turn. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, echoing off the houses until flashing blue lights swept across the block. The impostor's SUV hadn't gotten far. It was caught at the stop sign at the end of the street. When two patrol cars boxed it in tires, screeched doors flew open, real officers stepped out with hands already near their holsters, voices booming commands that cut straight through the night. "Vehicle off of hands where we can see them." The neighborhood turned into a theater. Kids who'd been watching from behind curtains pressed their faces harder against the glass. Neighbors who'd only peeked out now stepped fully onto porches, phones raised higher. Calvin and his friends moved closer to the curb, watching as the impostor's confidence shattered under real authority. The tall one raised his hands, reluctantly, jaw tight, while the shorter one kept muttering under his breath until an officer barked out. Now they both climbed out of the SUV, hands up, their fake bravado leaking away in real time. Jonas reddened, leaned toward Calvin now. "We'll see just how official they really are." One of the officers, Sergeant Willis Broad, shouldered mid-50s with the tone of a man who'd been doing this too long to play games, approached the SUV cautiously. His flashlight beam swept over the dashboard, the back seat, the gear tossed carelessly inside. He turned and called to his partner. "Yup, looks like props, not even police-grade equipment." The second officer, younger but sharp-eyed, pulled the fake vest off the shorter imposter and held it up. "You boys, buy this online. Doesn't even have the right stitching for tactical wear." The imposter tried to speak. "We're with HOA Enforcement. This is a misunderstanding." Sergeant Willis raised a brow. "HOA Enforcement, that's not a thing, son. And even if it was, you wouldn't be showing up in tactical gear, making threats." He glanced toward the growing crowd of neighbors, many of whom nodded and called out in agreement. Calvin spoke up, his voice caring. "They told me I had 48 hours to leave my house. They handed me fake papers. They threatened to handle it their way. If I didn't comply, that brought a ripple through the neighbors, more murmurs of outrage. Phones recording every second." The younger officer turned to the imposters. "You realize impersonating law enforcement is a felony, right? Carrying gear like this to intimidate people. That's serious time." The tall one clenched his jaw. "We weren't impersonating cops. We were representing the HOA. They sent us." "Then let's call them right now." Pierce Lockhart shouted from behind. "Calvin, well, the HOA president, Patricia Landon. Let's see if she's ever heard of you." The officer nodded, pulling out his notepad. "Good idea. We'll verify." He scribbled down the name. "But until then, you two are detained for questioning." The shorter imposter's face turned red. "You can't do this. We were just trying to—" Sergeant Willis cut him off, stepping closer with his voice hard as steel. "You were just trying to—" What trick a man into leaving his home, scare him in front of his kids? Don't play dumb. You're lucky this didn't escalate worse. Because half this block has your act on video. The imposter shut his mouth, staring at the ground. Dean Morris crossed his arms, speaking loud enough for the crowd. These guys picked the wrong neighborhood, thought they could run a scam and slip out before anyone questioned them. They didn't count on people standing together. The crowd hummed in agreement, some even clapping lightly. The tension that had hung thick over the street was shifting into relief, though the anger at what had nearly happened lingered. The younger officer moved to cuff the imposters, reciting their rights in a crisp, practiced tone. The tall one stiffened but didn't resist. The shorter one squirmed, throwing one last desperate look at Calvin. "This isn't over, you'll regret this." Calvin met his stare without flinching. "No, the only thing I'll regret is if you ever show your face here again." As the officers guided the men toward the patrol cars, Jonas leaned toward Calvin. "This is what justice looks like in daylight. No shadows to hide in." Calvin exhaled slowly, watching the impostors finally being placed in the back seat. The neighborhood buzzed with relief, the energy changing now that the threat was contained, but he couldn't shake the thought of what might have happened if his friends hadn't shown up when they did. Sergeant Willis returned, nodding toward Calvin. "We'll need you to give a statement, same for your neighbors, but I'll tell you this. It's a good thing you stood your ground, these guys. They've probably run this scam before tonight. It ends." Calvin gave a grateful nod. "Appreciate you, officer." The crowd began to disperse slowly. Conversations, buzzing, neighbors thanking Calvin and his friends. Some shaking hands, others offering to share their video recordings with the police. Kids whispered to one another, eyes wide, retelling what they'd just seen, like it was a movie. But as the flashing lights painted the street, Calvin's chest stayed tight. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every homeowner, every person who could have been tricked if these men had knocked on a different door. And the next day, the weight of what happened would ripple through the entire community. By the next morning, word of what had happened on Calvin Dunmore Street had spread beyond the cul-de-sac. It wasn't just neighbors whispering across lawns anymore. Local Facebook groups were buzzing with posts, clips from phone cameras had been uploaded, and even the Concord Gazette had a small article online. Men posing as HOA enforcers arrested after confrontation on residential block. Calvin sat on his porch with a mug of coffee, the air cooler than usual, watching as car after car slowed down when passing his house. Some drivers rolled their windows down to glance. Others nodded in solidarity before moving on. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but last night had turned him into something of a reluctant figurehead. Jonas joined him, leaning against the railing with his arms crossed. "You realize you're probably a local hero now, right?" Calvin shook his head. "I'm no hero. I just didn't want to be bullied out of my own home." He sipped his coffee, staring at the street. "Truth is, I keep thinking what would have happened if I'd been alone. If you guys hadn't shown up. If the neighbors hadn't recorded." Jonas's voice softened. "That's why last night matters, because it shows how easy it is to get tricked when you're isolated. But together, whole different story." A group of neighbors approached the porch. Mrs. Hadley, who lived 2 doors down, spoke first. "Calvin, we all wanted to thank you. What you and your friends did. It kept this neighborhood safe. I've got grandkids in my house. If they'd knocked on my door instead of yours." Her voice trailed off, her hand trembling slightly. Calvin stood, setting his mug aside. "You don't have to thank me. Honestly, I was scared too, but sometimes you don't get to pick the fight. It just shows up on your doorstep." Another neighbor, Luis Ortega, held up his phone. "I sent the video to the police this morning. They said it'll help build the case against those guys. If you hadn't stood your ground, Cal, they might still be out there pulling this on someone else." The group murmured in agreement, some nodding, others patting Calvin on the back. Pierce Lockhart wandered over from the driveway, catching the tail end of the conversation. He smirked. "Don't let him fool you, folks. Cal's tougher than he looks." Calvin shot him a look. "Don't start." The neighbors chuckled, but the laughter carried an undertone of relief. They were glad the danger had passed, glad the impostors had been caught, but the reminder of how close it had come lingered later that afternoon. A community meeting was called at the small recreation center, just a mile away. The place filled fast residents from blocks away. HOA board members, even local reporters showed up. Calvin sat near the front, his friends flanking him like a protective circle. Though their presence alone seemed to reassure everyone in the room. Patricia Landon, the HOA president, stood at the podium. She looked tired but resolute last night. 2 individuals impersonated HOA representatives and attempted to illegally evict one of our homeowners. Let me be clear, the HOA does not and will never enforce anything through intimidation or unannounced visits. This was a scam, and thanks to Calvin and his neighbors, it's been exposed. Applause filled the room. Though Calvin shifted uncomfortably in his chair, he didn't like being singled out, but he understood the importance. Patricia continued, "We're working with local law enforcement to ensure this doesn't happen again. But this is a reminder. If something doesn't look right, speak up, ask questions, protect one another." After the meeting, People crowded around Calvin and his friends. Some wanted to shake their hands. Others shared their own fears, stories of scam phone calls, suspicious letters, strangers knocking at odd hours. What had happened at Calvin's house wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a bigger problem, people using fake authority to prey on trust. Dean Morrick summed it up perfectly when someone asked how the SEALs had known what to do. He said it wasn't about being veterans, it was about standing up for each other. You don't need military training to see through a lie. You just need courage and sometimes backup from the people around you. That line stuck with people. By the next day, it was quoted in a community forum post that racked up dozens of comments. Some residents even suggested starting a neighborhood watch, not to patrol like police, but to make sure everyone had someone to call if something suspicious happened again. Calvin read those posts late that night while sitting in his living room, the quiet settling in after a whirlwind of a day. He thought about how close he'd come to losing his temper, how close the impostors had come to forcing their way in. Then he thought about the sight of his friends standing shoulder to shoulder on his lawn, the neighbors lifting their phones, the officers pulling up with sirens blaring. The lesson wasn't just about him keeping his home. It was about what happens when people refuse to be silent, when they refuse to let intimidation win. But for Calvin, the true weight of it all wouldn't settle until he sat alone with his thoughts and realized just how easily things could have gone the other way. That night, long after the neighborhood meeting, Calvin sat on his back porch with the last of the embers glowing in the fire pit. His friends had gone back to their hotels. The crowd of supportive neighbors had dispersed and the street was quiet again. For the first time in 24 hours, the weight of what had happened pressed in without distraction. The house felt different now, not unsafe, but fragile. For years, it had been his sanctuary, a place where he could come home from work, kick his shoes off and know the walls around him belonged to him alone. Yet one knock from two strangers had almost torn that sense of safety apart, and if his friends hadn't pulled up when they did, the night might have gone a very different way. Jonas, who had lingered a little longer than the others, eased into a chair across from him. He had a beer in one hand, the bottle sweating in the humid Carolina night. He didn't speak for a long moment, just watched the fire dance. Then he said, "You know what sticks with me? It wasn't their costumes or the way they tried to sound official. It was how sure they were. You'd fold. They counted on fear doing the heavy lifting." Calvin nodded, staring into the orange glow. "That's what makes me mad. Not just for me, but for anyone who might have believed them, my mom's place. She'd have opened the door, seen the vests, and probably let them walk right in. That's what." Burns, Jonas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Then maybe that's the lesson here. Fear works when people stand alone. But when a community stands together, scammers, bullies, they can't win." The words sat heavy between them. Calvin thought of the crowd of neighbors, the phones raised high, the way strangers had turned into allies in the heat of the moment. He hadn't realized how strong his streak could be until last night, tested it. The next morning, Calvin took a walk down the block. The air was fresher than usual, or maybe it was just his mood. He passed by Miss Hadley's house where she waved from her porch. Luis Ortega gave him a thumbs up while loading his truck. Even the teenagers on the corner, usually too cool to acknowledge anyone, gave him a nod of respect. It struck him the impostors had wanted to divide, to isolate, to intimidate. Instead, they had united a neighborhood later that week. Sergeant Willis called him with an update. The two impostors were facing multiple charges, impersonating law enforcement, attempted fraud, and trespassing. Among them, Calvin listened, feeling both relief and something else, a kind of sober gratitude. It wasn't just that justice was being served. It was that this nightmare had turned into a reminder of the values his father had drilled into him years ago. Stand your ground. Tell the truth and never let fear write your story. That evening, his friends gathered one more time for the cookout that had been postponed by all the chaos. Burgers hissed on the grill, laughter rang through the yard, and for a moment it felt almost normal again. But as the night stretched on, the conversation turned reflective. Pierce Lockhart raised his drink. "Here's to being in the right place at the right time." Dean Morris counted. "Here's to Cal for holding his ground before we even got here. He didn't need us to stand tall. He already was. We just made the picture bigger." The men clinked bottles. The fire crackled and Calvin felt something swell in his chest. He realized that this house wasn't just wood, nails, and siding. It was a symbol of everything he'd worked for and protecting. Protecting the right to live without being bullied out of it, wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who might face the same scam. One day, he thought about what he wanted his kids to take away from this, what he wanted his neighbors to remember. And when the laughter faded and the night quieted again, he knew the moral was simple. Authority is not in the vest you wear or the badge you flash. It's in truth, in community, in standing shoulder to shoulder. When lies try to break through, fear only wins. When people let it as the fire dimmed. Calvin looked at his friends and then at the street beyond his fence. He raised his voice just enough for them all to hear. If there's one thing last night taught me, it's that we don't get to pick when trouble shows up, but we do get to choose whether we face it alone or together, and together we can handle anything. The group sat quietly for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air, before Jonas finally grinned and broke it with a light quip about overcooked hot dogs. They laughed, the heaviness melting into warmth again for Calvin. The fear of that knock at the door would never completely fade, but neither would the memory of his friends and neighbors standing firm against intimidation, and that balance. The fear and the unity was what he carried forward. So if you take anything from Calvin's story, let it be this: never be afraid to question authority, never let intimidation corner you, and always stand with the people around you. Together, you're stronger than any scam or bully. And if stories like this remind you of the importance of community, courage, and truth, then make sure you hit that subscribe button. There are more lessons worth telling and more reminders that standing together can turn fear into strength.